1,100 feet under the Lackawanna Valley in the spring of 1891, a crew of anthracite miners drove their picks into a wall of coal they had worked for 3 days, and on the 4th day the wall gave way into open air. It should not have been open air. The seam ahead of them was supposed to be solid, 100 feet of unbroken black coal between their gangway and nothing at all. That is what the company map said. That is what the inspector had been told. And yet when the last of the coal broke loose and fell away into the dark, the men's lamps showed them a chamber on the other side, a timbered passage, props rotted soft, rails furred with rust, the floor sheeted in standing water that had not moved in a very long time, a tunnel, cut by hands, worked by men, and on no map that anyone in that colliery had ever seen. The fireboss held up his lamp and counted the timbers receding into the black. He did not know who had cut them. He did not know when. He only knew that according to every record the company possessed, no one had ever stood where he was now standing, and that the air drifting out of that older tunnel was the cold, dead, oxygen-starved air of a place that had been sealed against the living for decades. He told the men to stand back from the breach, and he listened, for the one sound every anthracite miner in that valley feared more than fire, more than gas, more than the roof itself, the sound of moving water. He sent a boy up the slope to bring the inspector. What the inspector wrote in his field book that day, we do not have. What he filed with the state weeks later said almost nothing, and the gap between those two things, between what a man saw underground and what he was willing to put his name to on paper, is the whole of this story. Now, I want to be honest with you from the first minute because this channel is built on the records, not on rumour. The scene I just described is a reconstruction, but it is not invention. It is built from the real, documented, repeated experience of anthracite mining in the Scranton region, in exactly this period, when crews really did break into workings no living person remembered, where men really did die because the maps were wrong, and where reports really were softened, shelved, and quietly forgotten to protect the people who would otherwise have had to answer. If that is the kind of history you want, the version that didn't make it into the school book, drawn from the newspapers, the inspection acts, the county records, and the ground itself, then subscribe and stay with me. Because by the time we are finished, you are going to understand what these crews were really walking into down there, and it is stranger and sadder than any legend. To understand what happened under Scranton, you have to understand what Scranton was. By 1891, the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys of northeastern Pennsylvania held the densest concentration of underground industry on Earth. This was the anthracite country, hard coal, the cleanest burning there is, the coal that heated the cities of the eastern seaboard and fired the furnaces that built the country, and it sat in seams that ran for miles beneath the towns themselves, so that Scranton was not a city sitting on top of the ground. It was a city sitting on top of a hollow. The men went down before dawn and came up after dark, and in the winter they did not see the sun from one Sunday to the next. They lived in the company towns, rows of identical houses owned by the colliery, rented back to the families, with a company store that sold them their food and their powder on credit, so that a man could work a whole month and end it owing the company money. They came from everywhere, Welsh and Irish miners who had carried the craft across the ocean, then Poles, Slovaks, Lithuanians and Italians sent into the worst of it. Whole nations of labour packed into a few square miles of valley. The work was a science of controlled danger. The men cut chambers into the seam and left great square pillars of coal to hold up the roof. The roof being in most places the underside of somebody's town. Room and pillar, they called it. And when a section was worked out, the most dangerous job in all of mining began, robbing the pillars, going back in on purpose to cut away the very columns holding the mountain up over your head, taking as much as you dared before the roof came down, because the coal was worth money, and a man was paid by the ton, not by the hour, and not by the risk. The dead were ordinary, not rare. Ordinary. A man crushed under a fall of roof, a man gassed in a heading nobody had ventilated, a runaway car, a premature blast, and the children, because there were children, Above ground in the breakers sat the breaker boys, 8, 9, 10 years old, hunched over the chutes for 10 and 12 hours a day, picking slate out of the rushing coal with bare fingers that bled and then scarred and then stopped feeling. Below ground went the youngest of all, the door tenders, little boys who sat alone in the dark, an entire shift to open and close the ventilation doors as the cars came through. The anthracite region buried its children with a regularity the rest of the country never had to look at and rarely chose to. This was not a frontier of mystery, it was a frontier of labour and of risk and of a profit that was always weighed against a human life, and usually found to be worth more. So where does the inspector come from? And why would he ever seal a report? He comes from a fire. On the 6th of September 1869, in the town of Plymouth, just down the valley, a fire broke out in the Avondale colliery. The mine had a single shaft, one way in, one way out, with a wooden breaker built directly over the top of it. When the breaker caught, the shaft became a chimney. The men below had no second exit and no air. 110 of them died underground that day, suffocated, while their wives and their children stood at the mouth of the shaft and listened and could do nothing. It remains one of the worst mine disasters in the history of the United States. Avondale changed the law. In its aftermath, Pennsylvania passed the first real mine safety legislation in the state's history, the Anthracite Mine Inspection Act of 1869, which required, among other things, 2 separate exits from every mine so that fire at one would never again seal men in. And it created something new, a system of state mine inspectors given the authority to go underground, examine the workings, measure the ventilation, study the maps, and report what they found. That is who the inspector is, the man the state sent into the dark to find out why men kept dying. On paper, the conscience of the industry. In practice, one man responsible for an enormous district crowded with collieries up against the most powerful economic force for 100 miles in any direction. When he found a violation, a working pushed too close to an old flooded tunnel, a ventilation plan ignored, a map everyone quietly knew was wrong, he was writing a document that could halt production, assign blame, and cost a great deal of money to people not used to being told no. And so the record of this period carries a recognizable shape. When disaster came, the company would insist it had warned the men. The newspapers would report grimly that the recovered bodies showed the men had not been warned. The union would demand to know why the mine was permitted to keep working when the danger was already known. And the official finding, often as not, would call it an accident, a misfortune, a tragedy of the coal itself, rather than the consequence of a decision made by a particular person for a particular reason. There was no single inspector and no single sealed report. That is the legend's version, and the legend always wants one secret, one document, one villain you could put in handcuffs. The truth is worse and quieter. There were hundreds of reports, filed across decades, that found a way to decline to say the thing everyone underground already knew. The ceiling was not dramatic. There was no vault, no shredder, no midnight order from Washington, only a man with a district too large to cover, a family to feed, and a pen, choosing again and again the wording that would not start a war he could not win. The cover-up was not an event, it was a habit. Now we come back to that tunnel, the one on no map, the cold air, the standing water, and the sound the fire boss was listening for. Here is the real terror of anthracite mining in 1891, and it has nothing to do with monsters. It is this: the coal fields had already been mined, not once, many times, by many companies going back decades, some long bankrupt, their engineers dead, their maps burned or sold, or very often never drawn at all. The ground beneath Scranton was not solid rock with a few neat tunnels in it. It was a honeycomb, layer over layer of workings, cut by different men following the same seams, and no one, not the company, not the state, not the inspector with his too large district, possessed an accurate map of what was already down there, which meant a crew driving a fresh heading through what the map called solid coal could at any moment break into an old working no record showed, and the old workings were almost always flooded. groundwater seeps in, the pumps stop when the company leaves, and over the years the empty tunnels become reservoirs held under tremendous pressure. So, when a crew holed through into one, what came through the breach was not still, ancient air. It was water, a wall of it under the weight of decades, exploding into the new working faster than any man alive could run. They called it a water blast. And it happened, for real, that very year. On the 24th of February, 1891, at the Jeansville mine in the anthracite field, a crew cut through into old flooded workings, and the inrush killed 14 men where they stood. That is not folklore, it is a dated, documented disaster of exactly the kind that our crew under Scranton was risking every single time their picks went into a wall that the map promised was solid. So picture it honestly now. The men understood the maps were wrong. They knew that somewhere in the black ahead of them lay the tunnels of earlier generations, full of standing water, waiting with no one to mark where. And they drove their headings into it anyway, because they were paid by the ton. The coal was right there, and a family had to eat. When a crew broke through and found, instead of the killing flood, only that cold dead air and the rotted timbers of men who had laboured there 50 years before, that was the good day. That was the day nobody drowned. That is what the fire boss was praying for as he stood at the breach and listened. And what the inspector found when the boy brought him down was not a mystery from before recorded time. It was proof, written in rusted rail and rotted prop and motionless black water, that the industry did not know its own ground, that it sent men by the thousand into a labyrinth it had never fully mapped, could not map, and in many cases had not tried to. And when it came time to write that down in a report with a name signed at the bottom, the honest words mostly did not get written, because to put it on paper was to admit liability, not just for this crew, but for every crew the company would send into that same dark the week after. And this is the point where the stories take over. If you've spent any time in the world of buried history, you've heard the other version of Pennsylvania, that there are tunnels under these cities no one will explain. Chambers down there older than the coal companies, built by someone else for some other purpose. That an entire world was here first, covered over, its records destroyed on purpose to keep us from ever knowing what it was. You've heard the words attached to all of it. A lost civilization, a buried old world, the whole Tartarian frame laid across the anthracite valley like a sheet over furniture. I want to tell you exactly where that story comes from, because it does not come from nowhere, and I will never insult you by pretending it does. It comes from real things. There are tunnels under Scranton that nobody can fully account for, because the maps really were lost. Crews really did break into workings no living person remembered, because no living person had ever written them down. The city has been sinking into itself for generations. Whole neighbourhoods across this region have subsided into the voids below, streets dropping and houses cracking over ground that is honeycombed and restless and full of the evidence of a vanished population. Every ingredient of the legend is real. The unmapped tunnels are real. The lost records are real. The bodies still down there, unrecovered and uncounted, those are real too. The legend takes all of that, every true piece of it, and reaches for the wrong explanation. It says a lost race, a buried old world, a magnificent secret that powerful men erased. The truth is more haunting, and it asks far more of us. There was no lost civilization under Scranton. There was an industry that consumed men and boys by the thousands, that did not bother to map the ground it sent them into, that wrote its reports to protect the people who took the profit rather than name the people who took the risk, and that left so many of its dead-sealed inside flooded workings that no one will ever recover them. The buried old world is real. It is just made of coal miners, and the reason their record is so thin, so full of gaps and softened official words that a legend comes rushing in to fill them, is not that someone hid something marvelous. It is the plainest and ugliest reason there is. Nobody with power thought their lives were worth the paper it would have taken to write them down properly. The tunnels under Scranton are still there, miles of them, flooded, sealed, uncharted, threaded through the rock beneath the streets where people drive to work and raise their children and never think about what is holding the ground up. For more than a century, the state has been trying to do what the companies never did: Map the voids, pump the water where it threatens the surface, mark the places where the ground might still let go. It is patient, expensive work, and it is nowhere near finished because you cannot map what was never recorded. They have not found everything. They will not find everything. The ground does not give up all of its dead. The inspector who came down to look at that older working went back up the slope and filed a report that said almost nothing, and in that he was no different from 100 others, men doing an impossible job inside an industry that did not want it done. But the gangway did not cease to exist because he declined to describe it. The timbers are still rotting down there, the water is still still, and somewhere in the workings of the northern field, in tunnels that appear on no accurate map, are men who went down one ordinary morning paid by the ton and never came back up, not taken by anything from before history, taken by the ordinary, profitable, exhaustively documented indifference of their own time. That is the version the schoolbook left out. Not a buried race, a buried workforce, and the reason to dig it back up is not that it is strange or thrilling, it is that they were real, and they were owed a record, and they did not get one. So the next time you hear that there is something under Pennsylvania that no one will explain, believe it, there is. It is the men. Learn their names where you can, remember them accurately, and you will have done more for the truth than any legend ever could. If this is the kind of history you want to keep finding, subscribe and pass it along to one person who still thinks they know what happened in those valleys. The record is down there, under the soybeans and the streets and the standing water. We just have to be willing to read it as it actually is. I'll see you in the next investigation.